Hi there, welcome to Fantasy Hub. I'm Mia, your storyteller. Today's story is filled with heartache, discovery, and a twist you won't see coming. So let's begin.
In the heart of Portland, where autumn mist clings to cobblestone streets like whispered secrets, stood a workshop that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Here, in this converted carriage house that smelled of linseed oil and old dreams, Evelyn Chun had built her sanctuary. At 43, Evelyn possessed the kind of beauty that comes to women who have survived. Heartbreak and emerged wiser, her raven hair now streaked with silver that caught the light like moonbeams, her dark eyes holding depths that spoke of secrets carefully guarded and truths slowly discovered. She moved through her workshop with the grace of someone who had finally found her calling, her hands as steady as a surgeon's as she breathed life back into abandoned dolls. The workshop itself was a cathedral to forgotten childhood shelves lined with porcelain faces in various states of repair, their glass eyes reflecting stories of little girls who had once whispered their deepest fears and brightest dreams into painted ears. Some dolls were missing limbs, others bore the scars of time and neglect, but all waited patiently for Evelyn's tender ministrations to make them whole again. On this particular October morning, as golden light filtered through windows painted with frost, Evelyn was absorbed in her most delicate work, yet restoring a 19th century French bisque doll whose porcelain face had been cracked by decades of careless handling. Each hairline fracture required patience, precision, and a kind of love that few understood. But Evelyn understood. She had become an expert in the art of repair, in seeing past damage to the beauty that lay beneath. Perhaps because she too knew what it felt like to be broken, to be handled carelessly by those who should have treasured her most. Her marriage to Alan had ended 6 months ago, not in the explosive devastation of betrayal or cruelty, but in the quiet suffocation of two people who had built their life on the foundation of who they thought they should be rather than who they truly were. 20 years of matching dinnerware and planned vacations, of conversations that skated over the surface of deeper truths, of love that felt more like performance than passion. The divorce had been as civilized as their marriage papers. Signed, property divided, mutual friends assured that they would remain on good terms. But what no one understood, what Evelyn herself was only beginning to acknowledge, was that the end of her marriage had not been a loss, but a liberation. For the first time in 2 decades, she could breathe without measuring each breath against someone else's expectations. Here, in her workshop, surrounded by broken toys that trusted her to make them beautiful again, Evelyn had discovered something she'd lost so long ago, she'd forgotten it had ever existed herself. She was so absorbed in her delicate work that she didn't hear the soft footsteps approaching her door, didn't notice the shadow that fell across her workbench as someone peered through the window with obvious hesitation. The knock, when it came, was gentle but insistent, 3 soft taps that made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. Evelyn, it's Miranda. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I brought coffee and ... Well, I was hoping we could talk. Miranda Reeves stood in the doorway like an answered prayer Evelyn hadn't known she was offering. At 38, Miranda possessed an effortless elegance that seemed to flow from genuine confidence rather than careful performance. Her auburn hair caught the morning light, and her green eyes held warmth that had become increasingly precious to Evelyn over the past few months. What had begun as a professional relationship, Miranda was a serious collector of antique toys who had sought out Evelyn's expertise for several restoration projects, had evolved into something that made Evelyn's pulse quicken whenever she saw Miranda's name on her phone. Something that made her choose her clothes more carefully on days when Miranda was scheduled to visit. Something that made her question assumptions about herself that she'd held for 43 years. Miranda, Evelyn said, setting down her tools with hands that trembled slightly. You're never an interruption. Please come in. Miranda stepped into the workshop, and as always, her presence seemed to fill the space with an energy that was both calming and electrifying. She wore jeans and a soft cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Evelyn's monthly rent, but she wore them with the unconscious grace of someone who had never needed to think much about money or appearances. I brought that blend you liked, Miranda said, holding up a cardboard carrier with 2 cups. The one from the place on Hawthorne. And I have something I need to tell you. Evelyn accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma that always reminded her of possibility and new beginnings. Over the past few months, These coffee visits had become the highlight of her week conversations that ranged from the technical aspects of doll restoration to philosophical discussions about art, beauty, and the courage it takes to create something meaningful in a world that often values convenience over craftsmanship. But more than that, they had become something Evelyn had never expected to find again, moments of genuine connection with someone who saw her, really saw her in ways that felt both thrilling and terrifying. "What did you want to tell me?" Evelyn asked, though part of her was afraid to hear the answer. In her experience, conversations that began with, "I need to tell you something," rarely ended well. Miranda settled herself on the wooden stool that Evelyn kept for visitors, her long legs folding gracefully as she studied Evelyn's face with those perceptive green eyes. "I've been thinking about our conversation last week, about masks and authenticity, and the courage it takes to show someone who you really are. Last week, the conversation that had kept Evelyn awake for 3 nights running, replaying every word, every glance, every moment when the space between them had seemed charged with possibility they were both too afraid to acknowledge. They had been discussing the German automaton in Miranda's collection, a doll that played music while its porcelain head turned and its glass eyes blinked, but somehow the conversation had drifted to broader themes. The ways people present different faces to the world, the masks we wear even when we're trying to be authentic, the exhausting performance of being who others expect us to be instead of who we actually are. "I've been thinking about that too," Evelyn admitted, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a bird desperate to escape its cage. Miranda leaned forward slightly, close enough that Evelyn could smell her perfume, something subtle and expensive that made her think of secret gardens and moonlit nights. "I keep wondering if you meant what you said about being tired of living in translation, about wanting to stop being the edited version of yourself." The workshop seemed to contract around them, the shelves full of watching dolls bearing witness to a conversation that felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the next word spoken would determine whether they flew or fell. "I meant every word," Evelyn said quietly, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "I'm 43 years old, Miranda. I've spent the better part of 2 decades being who my husband needed me to be, who my friends expected me to be, who society told me I should be. I'm tired of performance. I'm tired of pretending." "And what would happen?" Miranda asked, her voice soft but intense. "If you stopped pretending, what would that look like?" It was such a simple question, but it carried the weight of revolution. Evelyn looked around her workshop, taking in the evidence of her true calling, the careful restoration work that fed her soul, the creative space she'd built for herself, the life she was slowly constructing from the pieces of who she actually was rather than who she thought she should be. "I think," Evelyn said carefully, "it would look like being honest about what I want instead of what I think I should want. It would look like acknowledging that some of the things I've always believed about myself might not be true." Miranda stood then, moving closer to Evelyn's workbench, close enough that the air between them seemed to shimmer with unspoken possibility. "And what have you always believed about yourself that might not be true?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, like an invitation, like a door that once opened could never be closed again. Evelyn felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but opening, like ice giving way to spring thaw. "I believed," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "that I was the kind of woman who could only love men. That I was straight, CONVENTIO, no, safe. That the feelings I sometimes had about other women were just admiration or curiosity or something that didn't mean anything real." Miranda's breath caught audibly. "And now I think maybe I was wrong about a lot of things." They stood there in the golden morning light, surrounded by the watchful presence of Evelyn's restored dolls, and Evelyn felt the last of her carefully constructed defenses crumble like walls that had been built on sand. "Miranda," she said, though she wasn't sure what would follow her name. "Yes, I think I'm falling in love with you." The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossibly deep chasm. Miranda's eyes widened, and for a moment that felt like eternity, Evelyn wondered if she had made the most catastrophic mistake of her life. Then Miranda smiled, expression so radiant it seemed to illuminate the entire workshop, and stepped even closer. "I've been in love with you for months," Miranda confessed, her voice trembling with the relief of finally speaking the truth. "I've been hoping, praying, that you might feel the same way." And then, as naturally as breathing, they moved toward each other. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, like a question being asked and answered simultaneously. But when Miranda's lips parted under hers, when Evelyn felt the warm slide of Miranda's tongue against her own, something ignited inside her that had been dormant for so long she'd forgotten it existed. This was what she'd been searching for, without knowing what she was looking for. This connection, this passion, this sense of coming home to herself through the act of loving someone who saw and accepted her completely. They might have stood there kissing forever, lost in the revelation of mutual desire finally acknowledged. They might have talked about what this meant, what came next, what they were willing to risk for the possibility of real love. Instead, they heard the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway outside, followed by familiar footsteps on the gravel path that led to the workshop door. "Evelyn?" Alan's voice called out, accompanied by his distinctive knock 3 quick raps, followed by 2 slower ones, the same pattern he'd used throughout their marriage. "I brought lunch. I was hoping we could talk about those papers you need to sign." Both women froze, still close enough to feel each other's breath, close enough for anyone walking through that door to understand exactly what they had interrupted. The key turned in the lock, a key Evelyn had forgotten Alan still possessed, and the door swung open. Time, I have learned in my many years upon this earth, has a peculiar way of crystallizing in moments of crisis. A single second can stretch into infinity, allowing us to see with perfect clarity the full weight of choices made and paths taken. As Alan Chun stepped into that workshop carrying takeout containers from their old favorite restaurant, time performed exactly such alchemy. Alan, at 51, remained the man Evelyn had fallen in love with when they were both young and uncertain, his black hair now distinguished with silver, his face bearing lines that spoke of responsibility rather than joy, but still possessed of the steady handsomeness that had attracted her in their graduate school days. He represented everything safe and familiar in Evelyn's world, every choice she had made in favor of security over passion, convention over authenticity. He was also still holding the lunch containers when his eyes registered the scene before him, his ex-wife standing intimately close to another woman, both flushed and breathing hard in the unmistakable aftermath of a kiss. The containers hit the floor with a crash that echoed through the workshop like breaking porcelain. Pad thai and green curry splattered across the hardwood, the aromatic steam rising between the 3 of them like incense at an altar where truth was finally being worshipped. "Jesus, Evelyn," Alan breathed, his voice carrying 23 years of shared history and 6 months of careful divorce proceedings. "I mean, I knew we had problems, but I never imagined, ... He trailed off, his gaze moving between Evelyn and Miranda with an expression that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't acceptance either. Confusion, perhaps. The particular bewilderment that comes from discovering that someone you thought you knew completely had been hiding fundamental truths about themselves. Miranda, to her credit, didn't flee. She didn't apologize or shrink or attempt to minimize what Alan had witnessed. Instead, she extended her hand with the same quiet confidence she brought to everything else. "You must be Alan," she said calmly. "I'm Miranda Reeves. I've heard so much about you." Alan stared at the offered hand for a long moment, his lawyer's training warring with his personal shock. Finally, professional courtesy won out, and he accepted the handshake with the automatic politeness of someone who had been taught to maintain composure even in crisis. "Miranda, yes, the toy collector." His voice was carefully neutral, but Evelyn could hear the undercurrent of questions he didn't know how to ask. "Evelyn has mentioned you." Another understatement that spoke volumes. Evelyn had, in fact, worked Miranda's name into nearly every conversation they'd had during their weekly coffee meetings, their attempt to maintain friendship after the divorce, to prove to themselves and everyone else that they could be civilized. About the dissolution of their marriage. "I should go," Miranda said, but her eyes were on Evelyn, asking a question that had nothing to do with immediate logistics and everything to do with courage and commitment and the willingness to fight for something worth having. "No," Evelyn said, the word emerging with more strength than she'd expected. "No, don't go." "Alan, I'm sorry you found out this way, but I'm not sorry about what you found out." The statement hung in the air like a declaration of independence. And Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest, a sense of alignment, of truth finally spoken aloud. Alan looked around the workshop as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The careful organization that spoke of someone who had found their calling. The soft lighting that created an atmosphere of creativity and peace. The way Evelyn moved through the space with a confidence and contentment he had never seen during their marriage. This is why, he said quietly, not asking a question, but making a statement of understanding. This is why you were never really happy with me. Why you always seemed like you were waiting for something I couldn't give you. Evelyn felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. After 6 months of careful conversations about property division and mutual friends, Alan was finally seeing her clearly. I didn't know what I was waiting for, she admitted. I just knew that the life we built together felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. Not because there was anything wrong with the clothes, but because they weren't made for my body, my shape, my actual self. Alan nodded slowly, his gaze moving to Miranda with something that might have been curiosity rather than hostility. And she fits? It was such a simple question, but it carried the weight of 2 decades of marriage, of trying to force incompatible pieces together through sheer determination and good intentions. Yes, Evelyn said without hesitation. She fits. Alan was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the methodical approach he brought to complex legal problems. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that surprised them all relief. I think, he said carefully, I've known for a long time that we were better as friends than as spouses. I think I've been as afraid to admit it as you have. What followed was perhaps the most honest conversation Alan and Evelyn had shared in years. They sent Miranda to clean up the spilled food while they talked, needing space to navigate the complex emotions that came with the dissolution of old patterns and the acknowledgement of new truths. How long? Alan asked, settling into the visitor's chair while Evelyn perched on her work stool. How long have I known about women? Or how long have I been in love with Miranda specifically? Both, I guess. Evelyn considered the question seriously, understanding that Alan deserved honesty even if honesty was complicated. I think part of me has always known, but I was too afraid to look at it directly. There were signs, the way I responded to certain actresses, the dreams I had that I convinced myself didn't mean anything. The fact that sex with you always felt like performance rather than passion. Alan flinched slightly at the last comment, but he didn't interrupt. As for Miranda specifically, Evelyn continued, I think I started falling in love with her the first time she walked into this workshop, but I didn't let myself acknowledge. And until recently, what changed? Evelyn looked around her workshop, taking in the evidence of the life she'd built for herself after their divorce. I changed. Being alone forced me to figure out who I actually am, instead of who I thought I should be. And once I started getting to know myself, I realized that a lot of my assumptions were wrong. Miranda returned then, having disposed of the food containers and cleaned up the mess. She moved with obvious caution, clearly uncertain about her place in this conversation between ex-spouses who were navigating uncharted emotional territory. Actually, Alan said, surprising them both, I'm glad you're here, Miranda, because there's something I need to say to both of you. He stood and began pacing the small workshop, his movements betraying the nervous energy he usually kept carefully controlled. I've been thinking a lot about our marriage, Evelyn, about what went wrong and why, and I've realized something that's been hard to admit. He stopped pacing and faced them both directly. I think I knew you weren't happy. I think I knew you were forcing yourself to feel things you didn't actually feel, but I was too afraid to address it because addressing it would have meant admitting that I wasn't enough to make you happy. Evelyn felt her heart break a little for this good man who had tried so hard to love her in the only way he knew how. Alan ... quote, let me finish, he said gently. I've also realized that I wasn't really happy either. I was comfortable, secure, following the script we thought we were supposed to follow. But happiness, real happiness, I haven't felt that in years. He looked directly at Miranda then, and his expression was curious rather than hostile. But I've seen Evelyn happier in the past few months than she was in the last 5 years of our marriage. And if you're the reason for that happiness, then I think I owe you a debt of gratitude rather than resentment. Miranda, who had been listening with careful attention, spoke for the first time since Alan's arrival. I love her, she said simply. I love who she is when she's not trying to be who someone else needs her to be. I love her passion for her work, her gentleness with broken things, her courage in facing difficult truths. I love her completely. Alan nodded as if this made perfect sense. Then maybe, he said, you can give her what I never could, the freedom to be herself without apology. It was then that Evelyn remembered the letter. There's something I need to show you both, she said, moving to the antique secretary where She kept her most precious belongings. From a small drawer, she withdrew an envelope that looked aged with time, though she had found it only the week before. I discovered this inside one of the dolls Miranda brought me for restoration, she said, holding up the envelope with obvious reverence. It was tucked inside the torso, probably hidden there decades ago. The envelope was addressed to Evelyn, in faded ink, though she was certain she had never seen the handwriting before. Inside was a letter that had changed everything. Asterisk, my dearest Evelyn. If you are reading this, then you have found not just the doll I restored for you, but the courage to become who you were always meant to be. I pray that by the time you discover these words, you will have learned what took me too many years to understand, that love is not about becoming what others need us to be, but about finding someone who loves who we already are. Do not be afraid of your authentic self. Do not let fear of disappointing others prevent you from disappointing yourself. Love is not about perfection. It is about recognition. When you find someone who sees and loves your true nature, you will understand that every broken piece of your past was necessary to prepare you for that wholeness. Be brave, my darling. Be true. Be yourself completely and without apology. With all my love, your authentic self. Asterisk, Alan read the letter twice, his expression shifting from confusion to wonder. This is your handwriting, he said finally. But how? I don't know, Evelyn admitted. But I think some truths are so powerful that they transcend ordinary explanations. I think love, real love, creates ripples in the universe that can reach across time to give us exactly what we need when we're ready to receive it. Miranda was studying the letter with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a beautiful mystery. Whether it came from the past or the future or someplace outside of time entirely, she said, it contains exactly what you needed to. Here, and in that moment, surrounded by broken dolls waiting to be restored, and the three people whose lives had been forever changed by the courage to speak truth, Evelyn understood that her real life was finally beginning. The autumn sun was setting outside the workshop windows, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that made even the scattered tools seem sacred. The three of them had spent hours talking, working through 20 years of accumulated misunderstanding, and 6 months of careful politeness, finally arriving at something that resembled truth. Alan had long since abandoned any pretense of anger or betrayal. Instead, he seemed almost relieved, as if a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had finally been lifted from his shoulders. I have a confession, he said as they prepared to part ways. I've been seeing someone too. Sarah, the paralegal from my firm, well, it's early days, but it's the first time in years I felt anything that resembles excitement about romance. Evelyn felt a wave of genuine happiness for her ex-husband, followed by something that might have been guilt. Alan, why didn't you say anything before? When we were having all those coffee meetings, trying to be friends? Because I thought it would hurt you, he admitted. Because I thought I owed it to our marriage to mourn it properly before moving on. Because I was afraid you'd think I'd been planning this while we were still together. Were you? Alan considered the question seriously. No, but I think my heart checked out of our marriage long before my mind did. I think we both stayed longer than we should have because leaving felt like failure. Miranda, who had been listening to this exchange with the respectful attention of someone witnessing the final healing of an old wound, spoke quietly. Maybe staying in something that isn't working is the real failure. Maybe leaving takes more courage than staying sometimes. Alan nodded, then did something that surprised them all. He moved toward Miranda and extended his hand again, this time with genuine warmth rather than polite courtesy. Take care of her, he said simply. She deserves someone who sees how extraordinary she is. I will, Miranda promised, and the sincerity in her voice made Evelyn's eyes fill with tears. After Alan left, carrying with him 20 years of shared history and the blessing of a friendship that could finally be authentic, Evelyn and Miranda found themselves alone in the workshop as darkness settled around them like a benediction. So, Miranda said, settling beside Evelyn on the small sofa she kept in the corner for long restoration projects, what happens now? It was such a simple question, but it carried the weight of revolution. Evelyn looked around her workshop, taking in the evidence of the life she'd built for herself, the careful restoration work that fed her soul, the creative space that reflected her true aesthetic, the peace she'd found in solitude that had prepared her for the deeper peace of authentic love. Now, she said, taking Miranda's hand in hers and marveling at how perfectly their fingers interlaced, we figure out what love looks like when it doesn't have to hide. We learn how to build something together that honors who we both actually are instead of who we think we should be. Miranda smiled, the expression that had first captured Evelyn's heart 6 months ago, now holding the promise of countless future smiles. I love the sound of that. They kissed then, surrounded by dolls that had been broken and made beautiful again, and Evelyn understood that her own restoration was finally complete. Not because she had found someone to fix her, but because she had finally learned to see herself clearly enough to recognize love when it offered itself freely. The mysterious letter had been right about everything. Love was not about perfection, but about recognition. She had found someone who saw her authentic self and loved what she saw. Every broken piece of her past had been necessary to prepare her for this wholeness. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the Portland sky, and inside her workshop, surrounded by the evidence of her calling and the warmth of unexpected love, Evelyn Chen finally came home to herself. 6 months later, Evelyn stood in her expanded workshop, now shared with Miranda, who had moved her collection and her own restoration projects into the space they were building together. The workshop had become something neither of them could have imagined alone, a place where broken things were made beautiful again, where love was practiced daily through the patient work of healing. On the wall hung the mysterious letter, framed now like the sacred text it had become. Beside it was a photograph from their commitment ceremony, a small gathering of friends and family who celebrated their love without reservation or condition. Alan had been there, bringing Sarah, who turned out to be as lovely as her laugh suggested. They had all discovered that love multiplies rather than divides, that there was room in their hearts for friendship and new beginnings alongside the romance that had transformed everything. But perhaps most importantly, Evelyn had learned that restoration, whether of dolls or hearts or lives, was not about returning to some previous state, but about becoming what had always been possible. She had not been fixed by love. She had been revealed by it. And every day, as she worked among the dolls that trusted her to make them whole again, Evelyn whispered the same prayer of gratitude for the courage to break apart what wasn't working, for the skill to rebuild what could be beautiful, and for the grace to recognize love when it finally came home. In the end, dear souls, that is what all the greatest love stories teach us, that authenticity is worth the risk, that truth will always find a way to surface, and that sometimes the most profound healings happen in the quiet places where broken things wait patiently to be made whole again, even if those places happen to be workshops filled with forgotten dolls and hearts, brave enough to remember what it means to love without disguise.